The two things, again, that erode faith faster than anything else are lifestyle decisions that eventually impact what we believe and unexplainable circumstances where God doesn't seem to do what we think God ought to do. Now, here's what both of those scenarios, and there's lots of spin-offs of both of those, here's what both of those things have in common. For the purpose of this series, we're going to call that circumstantial faith. Circumstantial faith. I want you to just say that with me. Ready? Circumstantial faith is this. I'm trusting God and I'm believing in God, Christian God, whatever God. I'm believing or trusting in God based on my ability to find God in my circumstances. And when you were 12 years old, living at home in whatever town that was, and mom and dad said, this is how you're supposed to behave in a relationship with a young man or a young woman, you believed that, and it worked for you, and you held on to that. Then when you moved to the big city, and that didn't seem to be so practical anymore, and nobody else was behaving that way, you abandoned that based on what? Your circumstances. It was circumstantial faith. You always thought that God would protect you if you did certain things. It seems like God's not protecting you. You look around your circumstances, you don't feel protected, and you're not sure you believe in God anymore. Why? You have circumstantial faith. And to some extent, all of us have an element of circumstantial faith. That is, our beliefs about God and our faith in God, whether weak or strong, is impacted by what we see, by what we experience, by what the people around us do. That's called circumstantial faith. And there's a sense in which our faith in God, the Christian God or whatever God, or your faith in a philosophy, your faith in a modern-day writer, your faith in a modern-day philosophy, same thing, hinges on and leans against your experience. That's why we call it circumstantial faith. The problem is, circumstantial faith is always very, very fragile because, I don't know if you have recognized this or not, life is not consistent. There is a randomness to life. Seemingly, there is a randomness to God. There is a randomness to the events of life. And every time you think you have figured out the formula, 2 prayers, read my Bible and go to church. 2 prayers, I got the formula. I've got it worked out. Or, meditate, exercise, and eat right. Meditate, exercise, and eat right. I think that's the formula. Or it's, go to confession and go home for the holidays and, whatever your deal is. Every time we think we've got it figured out, something doesn't work out, and we look around our circumstances and say, what's wrong with God or what's wrong with me? That's called circumstantial faith, and it's always very fragile. The reason it's fragile, and you're probably already kind of figuring this out, the reason it's fragile, one reason is because we're not very good at interpreting events anyway, okay? I mean, the problem with circumstantial faith is I look in the vicinity of this week or this month and go, why didn't this happen and why didn't God? And I'm interpreting circumstances to say, well, since this happened and since the job didn't work out, since he never called me back and since my son hasn't returned, maybe God doesn't love me. I'm looking at my circumstances. But we're bad at interpreting events anyway. The classic case is if you had dropped into several times in my life as a parent, if you dropped into me interfacing with one of my kids and asked them, does your daddy love you? There would be times when my kids would probably look at you and say, no, he doesn't love me. Well, why? He's making me go to that dentist, And of course, as an adult, you're going, well, actually, that is evidence that he does love you. But if you ask my kids, or if you'd ask me as a kid, I'd say, no, that's evidence that he hates me, okay? Because it hurt last time, it's going to hurt this time. Why would somebody who loves me take me and sit me in a chair, put things in my mouth, and then walk out of the room and just let them have their way? I mean, that's not evidence of a father's love. That's some kind of weirdness. He probably needs counseling. So the thing is, we know from personal experience that at times in our life, we have been very, very bad at interpreting circumstances. Chances are you've had an event in your life that in the moment you thought it was terrible. 3 years later, you look back and you say, I am so glad that happened. Well, wait a minute, was it good or was it bad? Well, ultimately it was good, but it seemed like it was bad. Yeah, but if you had evaluated God's love for you in the moment when it seemed bad, you would have been wrong. But that's the problem with circumstantial faith. It's always very, very fragile, and we're not good at interpreting circumstances. In fact, we're not good at that at all. The other thing that makes us bad at interpreting circumstance is that our time frame isn't long enough, right? I mean, if something happens on Monday and you pray on Tuesday, you'll give God Wednesday, but by Thursday, something needs to be going on, right? Okay, God, I'll give you to the weekend. Okay, God, I'm going to be a gracious person. I'm going to give you 2 weeks to work this out, right? Our time frame is so short. And now this is so important. When we evaluate God's faithfulness, when we evaluate God's presence, when we evaluate God's intervention in a time frame that's short enough to suit us, but that doesn't suit him, we often conclude something's wrong with God. I pulled the lever and things aren't lining up. And I thought I knew how to do this. I thought God always. I thought God never. One of the most fascinating stories in the Bible, it's one of the longest stories about a person in the whole Bible. In fact, it might be the longest. It's the story of Joseph. Joseph, the coat of many colors. Maybe you heard about that. Joseph, if you don't know the story, Joseph was the key to getting the nation of Israel into Egypt. And in Egypt, they were persecuted, and Moses and all that famous part of the story. But Joseph was a critical element. And when you read his story, it's so fascinating. For 15 years, God didn't do anything for Joseph. And Joseph remained faithful. And when you read the story, it's very evident as an outsider that God is up to something. But when you're with Joseph and you're in the story, there's no evidence that God is up to anything. And time after time after time, Joseph continued to believe God, not based on his circumstances, but based on something entirely different that we'll talk about in just a minute. 15 years he was faithful to God, even though God didn't seem to be faithful to him. And when you read the story, you go, look what God did. And you go, yeah, but what if at any point in the story, Joseph had said, you know what? Clearly, this ain't working. Clearly, there's not a God, and if there is a God, he doesn't love me. But see, fortunately, he understood the time frame of God is oftentimes not the one that lines up with our time frame. So, one of the things that makes circumstantial faith so fragile is we don't interpret events very well. We don't know what God's up to half the time, and our time frame is too short. And then, the other thing is, and maybe you can relate to this, maybe not, we don't often interpret the voice of God very well. And now for some of you, this is going to just sound crazy, but if you were raised in the church, you're familiar with this. Every once in a while, you run into somebody, or maybe you are, again, one of those somebodies that hears from God, and somebody says, you know, well, God told me to, and God showed me that I need to, and God led me out of, and I listen to those people sometimes and think, wow, I think I wish God would speak to me that much, but that's a lot of accountability. Maybe not. I'd rather go with a hunch, then I could say, I didn't know. I thought I misunderstood, But you've met people, and I don't doubt that God speaks to people. I'm not saying that at all. But the problem is, when you are sure God has spoken to you, and then God doesn't do what you think God's promised to do, the tendency is to go, well, I don't know if I can trust God anymore. Well, maybe you misunderstood God. I mean, Sandra misunderstands me sometimes. I misunderstand her. I misunderstand my kids. They misunderstand me. If we kind of have that thing going on between human beings that we can see and get clarification, is it possible that maybe we misunderstand God? I think the answer is absolutely yes. But if your faith is leaning upon your ability to always hear from God and always get it right the first time, that's fragile faith. That's circumstantial faith. That is, I'm trusting God because I'm trusting him in the sphere of my environment and my experience alone. Fragile faith. Now, let me back up and qualify it, and then we're going to look at a verse together. For many of you, and I would be included in this, for many of us, it's true that God will oftentimes use an event or a set of circumstances to launch our faith. Now, this sounds like I'm contradicting myself, so follow me carefully. You're going along, life's great, you're not really interested in God, it's fine if there's a God, you don't care, you're busy, you're making a living, trying to get life going, get your kids through school, whatever. And then somebody invites you to a Bible study or a small group, or maybe somebody invited you to church, and you're just sort of like, whatever, they promised me lunch, and you show up, and the music starts, and then you see these baptism things, and then there's a message, and all of a sudden, you're kind of overwhelmed with this emotion, and you look back to that moment, and you would say, you know what? I just feel like God met me there. We hear those stories all the time at baptism. Or maybe you're going through a real tough time, and one night you turned off the lights and got on your knees beside your bed, and you don't know that you've ever done that, or you don't remember when the last time you did that was. And you started calling out to God out loud, saying, God, I don't know if you're there, but if you're there, I need you. And in that moment, something happened, and you look back to that moment, and you say, wow, that's when it started for me. That's when God became real. That event launched my faith. That event, that God moment, was the thing that kind of, was like the catalyst to my faith. Or maybe it was an answer to prayer. Here's my point. God often uses moments to launch faith. But those moments were never designed to be the foundation of our faith. Those moments often launch our faith, but never ever, as we're going to see, are we to lean our faith in God up against those moments. Because those moments come and those moments go. And sometimes God miraculously answers prayers, and sometimes He seems to be silent. And sometimes He works within our short time frame, and sometimes it seems like He ignores our time frame. We're looking at our watch, He's looking at the calendar, right? So the thing is, we have to be careful going forward, and this, we're about to narrow this down a little bit. Regardless of if you're a person who's bought into a philosophy of life, not a religion, if you're a person that celebrates a different religion than Christianity, or if you're a Christian, all three categories, your confidence and your faith is resting against something. If it is circumstantial, it is fragile, and eventually it will fail. And here's why. Because the sorrows of life and the tragedies of life will eventually cause there to be so many random experiences in your life that don't make sense, you will no longer feel like you can put your confidence in or trust this. At the same time, the pleasures of life will cause, listen carefully, the pleasures of life will eventually cause almost every single element of your belief system to become inconvenient. No matter what you've bought into today, the pleasures of life eventually will cause your belief system, this is I believe with all my heart, and I'll never give this up, and I'm holding on to this. Eventually, the pleasures of life, the temptations of life, will cause your current belief system, or parts of it, to become very inconvenient. In order to continue believing, you're going to have to give up some pleasure. And at the end of the day, if your faith is purely circumstantial, you will opt for pleasure over faith every single time. And you will adjust your belief system to match your lifestyle, which isn't necessarily a problem except for this. It means that what you have believed really probably isn't worth believing, and that what you believe today probably isn't going to be what you believe tomorrow. And none of that's a problem until you come to a place in life when you really, 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 really need something to be able to lean on. And if all you have is circumstantial faith, faith based on what I can see around me, experience around me, what I believe, what I expect God to do, eventually that will not hold you up. Now, here's one of the reasons I love being a Christian. And here's one of the reasons that, the more I read, the more I explore, the more I travel, the more I talk to people, the more I come back, and I'm just grateful to the point of being emotional about my faith in Christ. And that's this, that unlike current day philosophies and neat philosophers and all kind of the cool stuff that's going on today that's fun to read about, unlike many other, or really all other world religions, the foundation of Christianity is not an experience. The foundation of Christianity is not my ability to make the world make sense. The foundation of Christianity is not an event with God. It's not an answered prayer. It's none of those things that are oftentimes the catalyst of our faith. The foundation, the thing that we lean Christianity on, the thing that we lean on as Christians is so different than any other thing. It's the thing that makes Christianity stand out, and it's the reason I believe that some of you are coming back to church because you've spent a season of your life trying to prop your life up and prop your belief system up and prop your worldview up on something that worked for a while. But you're smart enough to know that you keep adapting your belief system to follow your behavior and adapting your belief system to follow your behavior. And at some point in life, you look up at the sky and you realize, I don't believe anything. I believe in me, and I'm not enough. And maybe you're back because you're hoping there's more to life than that. And here's some great news. There is. Now, how was that for an introduction, okay? I'm really going to cover one verse, so don't worry. If you have your Bibles, I just want to read one verse to you today. It's found in Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews is a hard book to find. I'll hit this quick, and then we'll get out of here and come back next week and pick it up. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. The book of Hebrews was written to Christians who were Jewish. They were Jewish Christians. And they had no real good reason to continue following Jesus because life was really bad for them. They'd lost their jobs. They'd lost their place in society. They were told that Jesus was going to come back soon. So in other words, I don't mean like in a few years. They were told like, don't even sit down. He's going to be back in a minute, okay? They believed he was coming back so soon, they sold all of their things and gave it all away because they didn't think they were going to need anything because Jesus was coming back. Now, Jesus didn't say that. In fact, Jesus said, I want you to go tell everybody in the whole world about me, then I'll come back. They missed that part. They just thought he's coming back in a minute. So when he didn't come back, they were losing faith. And so the writer of Hebrews writes these Jewish Christians, and he's pleading with them, don't give up your faith. Don't abandon Christianity. Don't abandon Jesus just because of your circumstances. In other words, don't make the mistake of propping up your faithfulness on what you can see and those unique God moments that happen every once in a while. And then in this verse, he gives us, in no unmistakable terms, the foundation of our faith. And this sets Christianity apart from everything else. And you know what? This is the only place to prop up your worldview and to prop up your belief system. This is the foundation of faith. Verse 14, Hebrews 4:14. I'm going to kind of pick through this verse real quickly for you. He says, therefore, and now he reviews everything he said so far in these 4 chapters so far. Therefore, since we have, present tense, right now, we have a great high priest, and let me say something about priest, okay? In our churches, we don't have priests because we believe Jesus was the last priest. Now, if you're Catholic or Episcopal, your priest can explain why those religions and versions of Christianity have priests, and I'm not trying to make a for or against statement, but we believe, because of verses like this, that Jesus was the great high priest. He was the final priest, and the priest was the person that represented people to God. And if you've ever been to confession, you know that you confess to your priest, and in some way that's a connection with God, and that's a very meaningful tradition for Catholics. I would never try to take that away. Well, in a similar way, the New Testament teaches that Jesus is the high priest, and consequently, we have access to God because of Jesus, the great high priest. So he says this, therefore, since we right now have a great high priest who has, past tense, has gone through the heavens. And that's a summary statement for Jesus' entire ministry and his whole life. If you read the other parts of Hebrews, that becomes clear. He says, since we right now have this high priest who in the past, a few years ago, from their perspective, showed up on the earth, walked around, performed miracles, claimed to be the Son of God, validated that through his life and miracles, who died on the cross, who rose from the dead and went to be with the Father. He says, since we right now have a high priest who did all of that, Jesus, the Son of God, and then listen to what he says next. Let us hold firmly, as in right now. Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. And let me put all that together, and here's the answer to the question of what is the foundation of our faith. He was saying to them, guys, I know it's tough, and I know it ain't working out, and I know Jesus didn't show up. And I know you're having a hard time being a Christian in a primarily Jewish culture where they're pretty hostile right now. I know that God's not answering your prayers, and I know your children aren't buying into it. I know things are tough. But don't quit believing. Why? Well, not based on what you see around you. Don't quit believing, because listen to what we have. We have in history a person who showed up and walked this earth as one of us, who was seen, who was touched, who was loved, who spoke, who performed miracles, who died on the cross in front of all of us, who was raised from the dead and seen by over 500 people, who claimed to have a unique relationship with God, and who claims to be the one who represents us to God. That's who we have. And since we right now currently have that, that's why we don't give up believing. In other words, the foundation of our faith is a person. The foundation of our faith is not an experience. The foundation of our faith is not an answer to prayer. The foundation of our faith is a person, Jesus Christ the Lord. And the reason that we believe when things are good and believe when things are bad is not because things are good or things are bad, and not because we can make sense out of life, and not because we can answer every question. The reason we believe is because 2,000 years ago, and here's the thing that sets Christianity apart from your current philosophies and your pop religion and your pop psychology and all the other religions of the world. 2,000 years ago, something happened. And the foundation of Christianity is something that happened in history. We believe because of something that happened years ago, not because of our ability to interpret circumstances right now. We have a Savior who is the great high priest, Jesus Christ, who passed through heaven and sits at the right hand of our Heavenly Father.